One of the things that we know about supercommunicators is if you ask them, have you always been good at communication? They tend to say no. It's a skill. If you're not having at least one bad conversation a week, you're probably not putting yourself out there enough, and you're probably not learning as much as you should. It's only when we start to say like, oh, I recognize this as a skill. I'm going to practice it a little bit. That practice is going to become a habit. That's when it becomes subtle. That's when it becomes art. But nobody gets to be Monet without painting a couple of canvases that aren't as good as you hope they'll be. And the same thing is true of communication. Like, we should all be practicing this. And if a failure just means that you're learning something new.
Charles, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being a guest.
Thank you for having me. This is such a treat.
It is an absolute treat. I will share. I just was so delighted when I saw your mail, and I'm telling you, you've been on my list of guests that I have to have on this show. Big fan of your work. Very accomplished.
That's really
author.
Nice of you to say.
and I would love, to me, it's interesting to have the guest articulate in their own words, why are you a guest in the show? I probably identify as an author, but give us a little more context.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a reporter. I've been a reporter for the last, over 21 years. In a kind of roundabout way. I started a company after I graduated from high school. After I graduated from college, I started a company, and I was about 3 years into building it, and I realized I really didn't know what I was doing, and so I decided to go to business school. And so I got into Harvard Business School, and I went there, and then basically midway through my first year, we sold the company. And so suddenly I had all of this like possibility and freedom in front of me. And I was trying to figure out like, what do I actually want to do? And I went through a bunch of different options, and being a journalist seemed like the most exciting one of them, particularly because I love to tell business stories, right? Like, I think that the work we do is some of the most important and vital and interesting stuff in our lives. So I love asking people like, what do you do for a living? And tell me about your job. and as I started doing that reporting, I eventually moved to the New York Times. One of the things that happened is that I was a correspondent in Iraq during the war, and I got introduced to this idea of the army as a giant habit change machine. And I also got introduced to the fact that like there was a lot of social science that was going on that was really powerful in terms of how we could live better, but that was not being read by average Americans because the papers are just hard to read. And so I got really interested in habit formation. I wrote this book, The Power of Habit, which did really, really well. And I was very lucky in that respect. And after writing that, I realized, I stayed at the Times for a couple of years, but I realized one of the things that I want to do is I want to write long form pieces like book chapters or magazine pieces that help us understand how the world works. And right before I left the Times, I had this experience with both my coworkers and my wife. And it was actually more with my wife that was more profound, that led to my most recent book, Supercommunicators, which is, I realized that I was in this pattern with my wife where I'd come home and I would complain about my day to her. And like, my boss is a jerk and my coworkers don't love me enough. And she would give me this really good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and get to know each other a little bit better? And I would get even more upset. Like, I could not hear what she was saying to me. And then she would get upset because I was like being mean to her for giving me good advice. And this stuff like this would happen at work too. And I'm a professional communicator, right? We're all like I'm sure I assume this is something you see in your own relationships at home. Yeah. Right. This happens to everyone. And so I thought, I'm going to go talk to experts, social scientists, and also neuroscientists and others to find out what's going on here. And that was the birth of Supercommunicators, because what I found out was just so fascinating and so much fun that I felt like other people could benefit from it.
Well, if you're talking about communicating with your wife, that's important, but it's also obviously super important professionally, emotional intelligence, connecting with others. We're social animals. And
Absolutely.
Yet communication is something that I feel like, this is one of the reasons when I saw you had the book out, I was immediately smitten, because I like when smart people who've written amazing books about other things like you have with habits. I mean, how many 3 million copies, something like that you sold? That's
actually
not
like 12.
There you go.
No, it's great. I'm very lucky.
Right. But it's because it was so profound. And to me, this is like when I see someone of your stature and writing skill take on another topic, I'm always immediately, it's a no questions asked grab. And communication is talked about very whimsically, flippantly even, and yet arguably, since we are social animals, it is at the core of our ability to
Absolutely.
connect or not. So
Yeah, that's
if
exactly
someone
right.
asks, is this important? Is it meaningful? It's sort of like, well, where do you put breathing on the scale of,
Yeah.
staying alive? And you put it pretty high. And I feel like communication's the same way. And yet, there's not a lot of great, legendary books about it. And you've written one. So, get us
Well,
into a little bit of the details here.
yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you pose it that way because you're exactly right. If you think about it, communication is actually Homo sapiens' superpower.
Mm-hmm.
Like the reason why our species has succeeded so well, better than any other species, is because we have this ability to communicate with each other. And our brains are hardwired
Mm-hmm.
to communicate well. And that's kind of what's happened in the last decade is that for a long time, we did not understand what was happening inside people's brains when they were having a conversation. But now, because of these advances in neural imaging and data collection, we're essentially able to see that.
Yeah.
And this gets at one of the first big ideas. And this is what the researchers told me that kind of helped me understand what was going on with me and my wife. They said, look, most people think that when you're having a discussion, it's about one thing, right? We're talking about like where to go on vacation, or we're talking about my book, or we're talking about, what's going on in your life. But actually, they said every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, those conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's usually some conversations that are about practical things like solving problems together or making plans. But then there's conversations that are about emotional things where I might tell you what I'm feeling and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society. And they said the thing that we figured out is if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, it is very hard to connect with each other. Right. So when I would come home and I would complain about my day, I was having an emotional conversation and my wife would respond with some pretty good advice and she was having a practical conversation. And those are both totally legitimate forms of communication, but they weren't the same form of communication. Right. So, right. So we just like drive each other crazy. And in psychology, this has become such a profound thing that it's actually has a name now known as the matching principle, which says that successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And that doesn't mean if you start emotional, you got to stay emotional, right? Most discussions will go from emotional to social to practical and back to emotional. But what's important is that you move through those together.
Do you feel like our natural state is alignment here, or
Yeah.
is our like where we step off the boat? Say you come home. Generally, does someone mimic the ability? Oh, Charles is in an emotional conversation, therefore I gravitate to it, or does it have more to do with our own individual states rather than us reading, the neurological sort of matching as the name of the thing? Is our natural state
Yeah.
to drift into the same sphere that the other person's operating in, or is that just randomized and it's when they don't line up that we have the bigger challenges?
So I think it's a really good question, right? And it's not just me matching you, it's sometimes me inviting you to match me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a give and take in a conversation. But what happens is that if we're not listening the right way, if we're not asking the right questions, if we don't really care what the other person is saying, we're just waiting our turn to speak,
Mm-hmm.
then it's really easy to have different kinds of conversations because I'm not really paying attention to what kind of conversation you're having.
Yeah.
But if I do make it a priority, then our natural instinct is actually to recognize what's going on here and to try to align with each other. And the reason why is actually rooted in our brain structure. When you're in a good conversation, your body and your brain begin to match whomever you're talking to. So like even in this one, we're separated by Zoom. You're in Seattle, I'm in California. But without us realizing it, our heart rates are starting to match each other and our breath patterns are starting to match each other. And most importantly, the activity inside our brains is starting to look more and more similar. And that makes sense when you think about it, because if I describe an emotion to you, you actually feel that emotion a little bit, right? Or if I describe an idea, you experience that idea. So it makes sense that our brains would become more similar. But what researchers have discovered is that when our brains become more and more synchronized, when we achieve what's known as neural synchrony, at that moment, or neural entrainment, at that moment, we can understand each other so much better. And we also feel connected. We feel like we trust each other, like we like each other. We feel like we we have a meaningful relationship. And that's why after a great conversation, you feel so good, is because your brain has evolved to crave neural entrainment and to seek it out.
There's an interesting principle by a French philosopher, René Girard. It's essentially mimesis, mimetic desire, that what we desire is basically what we can see in others. We don't really, it's more difficult for our hardwired brain to imagine something different. And this is why my thesis is that this is why one of the reasons that we, love rock stars. There's not that many of them. We see everybody else. We sort of are like them. Our lives are like them. When you, as you said, when you're together, your brains start to, match each other's brainwaves and heartbeats and all these things. And you don't really, as the journalist in you, when I read your work, you're reluctant, it seems like, to make, big statements about this stuff. You're really drawing on the facts and you're looking at, and yet, is there a part of you that finds that, man, I really wish we were better at doing something that is against, I'm just curious, because to me, this is the person that knows that you're a very smart and talented Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. Like, help me understand this.
So I think it's a really, really good question. And so I was a columnist for a little while at the Times, and I was basically terrible at the job because every time I'd come up with an opinion, I'd call someone to like get them. And after talking to them, I'd be like, you know what? They have a really good point. Maybe I was wrong before. So I tend not to make these big statements because I think that my process and most people's processes is to learn. And the truth is that like the things that are most true are never 100% true, right? The things that are most true are 90% true, but that 10% matters a lot. So to your point though, are there big things that I can say about communication? Absolutely. Yeah. I think the one thing I can say is we as a nation and people should get better at it, right? There have been periods in America's history when we've been really, really good at having conversations with people we disagree with, and it's made the nation much stronger. And right now we're in a cycle where like people don't want to talk about things that they disagree about, right? Because they know that it might get really heated really fast, and there's going to be personal attacks. Yeah. And I understand that hesitation. I feel that same hesitation myself, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous for a country. It's dangerous for a world. It's also just dangerous for our mental health, right? Like, I don't want to be in a fight with my neighbor based on some political sign he has on his lawn. Like we both spend 1% of our lives thinking about politics, and 80% of our lives thinking about the pothole on the street. So like, why should I feel alienated from him by this thing that he wants to vote for someone else? But we've gotten out of practice at having those hard conversations.
You reference in the beginning of our conversation, for example, conversation with your wife. And I'm wondering, was the backdrop of, popular culture right now, the fact that we are so sort of seemingly disconnected and divided, it just feels like we're communicating poorly. The science behind it says that we are communicating poorly. Did that have anything to do with the background of the book?
Yeah, definitely. I was interested. The last two chapters in the book are about this social conversation, right? And conversations about identity. And I was writing it not that long after like Black Lives Matter. And so like, companies were just getting torn apart by this stuff. And one of the chapters is about Netflix. In Netflix, there was this like a senior executive who uses the N-word in a meeting, and he got fired, but it like starts tearing the company apart. And I was just seeing that happen left and right. And the thing that Netflix found that the book describes is that there is a way to have these conversations where they go really well, right? There's a way to talk about things like race and politics and gender and, what bathrooms people should be using. We can have those conversations, and they're really successful if we know the skills to have them. And being a super communicator is just having a set of skills. Like, it's just understanding those skills. Anyone can be a super communicator. It's just about learning that this is a skill that I can use. And I'm not just going to use it with my best friends. I'm going to use it with people at work. And then conversation works.
At the risk of, I want to start saying all the things that I know about your work to show off, but
it's really nice of you.
I'm maybe honest to a fault, but I'm going to say that. So they're clearly you set these up as skills, learnable skills, and there are very, specific. You've got, boxes that talk about the things that we ought to know, and truths and POVs. And so what are some of these learnable
Yeah.
skills that, someone's like sitting in traffic or on a jogging path or on the park bench. What are
Something
some
they can do
skills?
right away.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
make
So
this accessible for us for a second, because the concept of communication is so massive. We're communicating, not only 10% verbal and 90%,
yeah,
it's just like, give us some things that we can, anchor on for just a few minutes here.
there's really three big ones, like three big skills that consistent super communicators seem to do. The first is this looking for clues about what kind of conversation are we having, and just asking yourself. And once you start asking yourself, it becomes really easy. Is this emotional? Is this practical? Is this social? But one of the ways to figure that out, and this is the second skill, is to ask more questions. Super communicators tend to ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person.
I was like, 10,
Yeah,
it's not 10 or 20 more. It's 10 or 20 times more.
Right. And the thing is, you hardly even notice it, because some of the questions are things like, oh, what'd you think about that? Or like, oh, that's interesting. What'd you say next? But some of the questions are special kinds of questions that are known within psychology as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks me about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. And this is the skill, is asking deep questions.
Yeah.
Because it can seem intimidating to do that, but it's as simple as like, if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, oh, where do you practice medicine? Asking them instead, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? Or what do you like about being a doctor? Those don't seem like overly personal questions, but they're deep questions, because what they do is they invite the other person to tell you, oh, like I actually became a doctor because I saw my dad get sick when I was a kid. Right. And now we're like talking about real stuff. And I can say, oh, that's interesting. I became a lawyer because I saw my uncle get arrested. Like, now we're having a real conversation. Now we're sharing about ourselves. And so super communicators, one of the skills that they cultivate is they look for opportunities to ask these deeper questions, that invites someone, but doesn't mandate, but invites them to talk about their values or their beliefs or their experiences. And then they reciprocate, either by asking more questions or by sharing something about themselves, but they show that they're engaged.
Let's push on this a little bit, because I have the experience of people, as someone who's been a guest on hundreds of other podcasts and hosted, I think, a couple thousand, maybe, or at least 1,000 guests here. I am occasionally, I would say, confronted. It feels like it feels like the right word, but it may be too strong, with someone who goes deep too soon. It's like too much too soon. And there's not a lot of sort of grace, or they are not skilled at this. And I would hesitate to give a specific example, but too much too fast. And I'm curious, this is why this is a skill, right? This is a thing that's almost an invitation and a connection, a collaboration, right? And you talk about in the book establishing the guidelines, like norms and stuff like that. And for people who are learning this, can you give us some tips about how not to
well,
put
let
your
me
foot
ask
in your
you
mouth or do a cannonball in the pool?
Totally. So let me ask you a question.
Sure.
When that happens, when you're in a conversation with someone and you ask what seems like a kind of innocuous question, and they just go deep immediately, they start talking about, like, my dad is sick and X and Y and Z. What are you feeling? Like, why is that? What about that is less than positive for you?
When it's asked of me, it feels artificial. It feels rushed.
Yeah. Right.
And it lacks a genuine, authentic desire. And it's like, this is a tool, so I'm going to pry myself in and jump in. And
I want to get you to cry on my podcast, so I'm going to ask about like the hard stuff.
Sure. And by extension, the opposite is, I feel like you could, after developing rapport, and you talked again about sort of establishing the guidelines, and there's a little bit of a social dance that we do, and that to me feels elegant and kind and thoughtful. And then there's another one, which is there's a vulnerable connection when someone volunteers that. It's sort of like this is an invitation, almost, when I volunteer it first rather than asking it to you. Like, what's the worst moment? I hate being asked superlatives, even like, what's your favorite song? Like, I think you're trying to connect with me, but about my favorite song of all time. There's 10 million songs.
Like, I haven't thought about it. Right? Like, you got to put me on the spot here.
Freeze the conversation because I'm going to have to go through my 8,000 favorite songs. So I'm trying to park or trying to land us. Like, there's a bunch of subtlety to this, and it is more art than science. And yet we know that these are steps that we need to take to make this connection. So,
well, and you used a really important word. You said when people invite me, right? Or when I invite someone. So think about the difference between saying to someone like, how's your dad doing? And, hey, I heard your dad's sick. How are you feeling about that? Mm-hmm. The first one's an invitation, right? Yeah. It's saying like, how's your dad doing? You probably know that I've heard that he's not doing great.
Yeah.
And if you want to get into it, you can be like, he's not doing great. Or you could be like, he's doing a lot better. Thanks for asking. But if I'm like, hey, I heard your dad's sick. Like, tell me how you feel about that. That's not an invitation. That's a mandate.
Yeah. Tell me how you exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I'm commanding you to say something deep and meaningful. And if it's a close friend, that might be invited. But if it's not, it might feel very alienating to have someone try and force you to get there. Yeah. And I think the other word that you use that's really important is authenticity. There's something that happens in conversations that's known as authentic reciprocity or reciprocity of authenticity, which is when I say something real, if you respond in kind, I appreciate it. But the goal of the response is to show me that you want to connect with me, not to try and turn the spotlight on yourself, right?
Yeah.
So if I say like, my aunt passed away last week, and you respond by saying, you try and match me by saying, I know exactly what you're going through. That's really hard. My dog died 5 years ago and I still think about him. That is not the right thing to say, right? Because what you're really doing is you're not trying to match me. You're trying to turn the spotlight on yourself. You're trying to say like, oh, I have some death trauma too that I can talk about. A much better thing to do is to say, tell me about your aunt. What was she like?
Yeah.
Now there might be times when someone says like, oh, I'm going to Belize, and matching does make sense. And you're like, oh my God, that's amazing. I just went to Morocco. We had the greatest time. Yeah. Like, what do you think about Belize? Or we've been to Costa Rica and it's close by. But what's happening there is that when I invite you to say something meaningful, I'm basically saying, I want to connect with you, but I want you to be a participant in it, versus a mandate is, I want to force you to give me something that I can use to think about myself.
Yeah.
And that feels less good.
It does. And the reason I'm inviting a discussion here is I observe people trying. And to me, it's difficult. It's difficult you don't want to shame people trying.
Totally.
And to realize that all of these are skills, and skills are developed. And if you're not willing to suck, then you're never going to be
You're not going to get good at them.
Right. Yeah. And yet there is so much subtlety in this. As someone who has arguably had hundreds of conversations as a profession for years, since 2009 on the show, for example, I don't necessarily identify as that, but I think that is a reasonably true statement.
Yeah.
It has been such a journey in understanding when things go well, when communication goes well, and when it's troubled or stifled or stagnated, or there's a lack of connection. You start to become increasingly aware of that. And I simultaneously want people who struggle with communication to be able to get better. And and then there's also, this is gonna, like, if you don't understand that there is a subtlety here, it can cause a lot of pain, mostly for you, because the other person can write you off, but you're like, man, I'm doing what Charles said and it's not working.
It's not right. And I think you got at something there, which is, it's a skill, right? And like, if the first time that one of our kids picked up a book and tried to read it and we were like, oh, you're a terrible reader, you should never try that again. Like, that's not how you like learn a skill, right? Like, you learn a skill by trying and experimenting and making mistakes and getting better. And what's interesting is One of the things that we know about supercommunicators is if you ask them, have you always been good at communication? They tend to say no. They tend to say things like, I was unpopular in high school. I had to like really study how to talk to other kids, or my parents got divorced and I had to be the peacemaker between them. And in the book, there's a story of this CIA officer who's sent overseas to recruit spies. And is like,
the book opens with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he's just terrible at the job, right? Like he's just miserable at recruiting spies until he learns how to connect with other people. And I would actually say to anyone who's listening, who's thinking about trying this, if you're not having at least one bad conversation a week, you're probably not putting yourself out there enough, and you're probably not learning as much as you should. I certainly have one bad conversation a week, oftentimes many more. And I think the point is that it's only when we start to say like, oh, I recognize this as a skill. I'm going to practice it a little bit. That practice is going to become a habit. That's when it becomes subtle. That's when it becomes art. But nobody gets to be, Monet without painting a couple of canvases that aren't as good as you hope they'll be. And the same thing is true of communication. Like we should all be practicing this. And if a failure just means that you're learning something new.
Let's talk a little bit about a thing that I referred to just in passing a little bit ago, but you do cover it often in the book. And I'm looking at a PDF in front of me. I've got one open, and there's a great picture. It's on page 73. It's very subtle, but I'm talking about the nonverbal communication. And I alluded to, how much is verbal and how much is not. Talk to us a little bit about that. The reason that I'm particularly interested in this is so much of communication these days is asynchronous. Yeah, we're communicating via Slack or text messages, or certainly, FaceTime and whatnot, or our ability to do this is somewhat of a middle ground. It's a patch, but it certainly plays a factor. And I'm just curious to get your take on that. First of all, overall, like nonverbal, and then second, like how you have some guidelines for us to think about this in a world where how we communicate is evolving, the very mechanisms, the technology behind
the channels are just exploding. Yeah. And the way I think about it is, well, in the story we tell, or in the book, we tell the story of the creation of the Big Bang Theory, that television show, where they really had to grapple with this because the characters are supposed to be bad at expressing emotions. And the question is, how do you convey to the audience what they're feeling when they're bad at, the whole gimmick is that they're bad at conveying emotions. One of the things, so we tend to talk about this in terms of not only nonverbal, but non-linguistic, because there's a lot of communication that happens where I'm not using a word, but it's the tone of voice, right? It's a sigh, or it's completely nonverbal. It's an expression. It's kind of how I'm holding my body. One of the things that we know is that the bigger the information stream, the easier it is to communicate. So if you and I are standing next to each other and having a conversation and we're looking at each other, the information stream is huge, right? I have so many things to choose from. Each step away from that, the information stream gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That does not mean that you can't communicate. It just means that you have to recognize that you have to do some things a little bit differently. And one of my favorite examples of this is actually telephones. So when telephones first became popular about 100 years ago, there were all these studies that said no one will ever have a real conversation on the phone. Right, because up till then, all conversations had happened face to face. And what's interesting is if you look at transcripts from the earliest telephone conversations, those people are actually exactly right.
Yeah,
nobody knows how to use the phone. They use it like a telegram. They call up and they're like, "Here's like my stock order," and then they hang up right away. And it actually took about 20 years for people to learn to use the telephones. And by the time, of course, we were teenagers, you could talk for like 7 hours a night on the phone.
Don't get me with my junior high girlfriend. I mean,
totally. So what's really interesting is what changed there. What changed is we learned how to use phones, and oftentimes we learned it in ways that we're not even conscious of. When you and I if we're talking on the telephone, we will over enunciate our words by about 20%. We will put about 30% more emotion into our voice. Now, we don't think about doing that, right? We're not even doing it consciously, but we recognize that on a phone, you have to they can't see you. So you got to behave a little bit differently. When it comes to these new forms of communication that are just in the last 10 or 15 years, Slack, text messaging, Snapchat, WhatsApp, they are very, very good forms of communication. if we recognize that they have slightly different rules. And for our kids, I have 2 teenagers at home. Like they know how to use emojis and texting no problem. Like it is pure communication for them.
Yeah.
For me, it's less so because it's not something I grew up doing. It's not something I spent a lot of time thinking about. But if you just take a second and you sit down and you think like, okay, I need to say this thing to this person. Should I do it via email or text or face-to-face or phone? Because I know that there's slightly different rules for each of those and slightly different strengths or weaknesses. You'll figure out pretty quickly like which form of communication you should use. Or if you're condemned to email, you'll know that like you shouldn't be so flip and sarcastic in an email because the person will take offense at it. They won't know that you're joking.
Yeah.
So that's what's important. What's important is just reminding ourselves that different forms of communication have different rules, but the underlying principles are the same.
The reason this question popped up to me is, again, the journalism aspect of so much of your writing. And yet I'm dying for Charles's opinion on so many of these. This is what I got. Scientists and like journalists are like, yeah, but what do you think? Tell me what you think. And I mean, the research says, I'm like, what do you say? So do you intentionally shape communication based on your strengths?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I get a lot of emails from readers and I respond to every single reader email, but before it goes out, I have an assistant who goes through and she edits it to be nicer. Because like oftentimes like I'm just sitting down and like plowing through it. Yeah. She's like, there's a little bit of a nicer way to say this. Or like you kind of reference his problem, but like it might be worth mentioning his problem a little bit more. And like what I'm doing there is I'm actively shaping the environment around the communication because I know that I'm really, really good at writing for big audiences. I'm less good at writing for a one-on-one audience. And so I need someone to like, to check, to just sort of say like, look, this looks good, or like, we can make this better. So, and if I'm going to have a tough conversation with my wife, I do not do it late at night. I do not do it like early first thing in the morning when the kids are about to go to school. Like I choose the time to have that. And I think one of the things that's really important is it's this issue of control. Like there was all these really interesting studies of married couples. And they found that married couples that are happy and married couples that are unhappy, they fight at about the same rates. Like there's not that big a difference in how much they fight. And they fight about basically the same topics. What is different is how much they try and control each other versus control things together. So unhappy marriages, the people in the marriage, they try to control each other a lot. They say things like, I'm not going to talk about that. Or, if you bring that up again, I'm going to walk out. Or I'm only going to talk about this for 5 minutes. Or you always say that. You can't say that. Or you shouldn't be feeling that. That's a dumb thing to feel. Good, happy married couples, they have that same instinct for control because when we're in a fight, we want to control something. But instead of trying to control each other, they do things like they control the environment and say like, look, let's wait until we have some time after having a glass of wine to talk about this. Or they try and control the boundaries of the conflict, right? Instead of like a fight about where we're going for Thanksgiving becomes, you don't earn enough money and your mother hates me. They say like, look, let's just talk about Thanksgiving. Let's not bring up money or like mothers. Like this is just about Thanksgiving. They control the boundaries of that. And they control the nature of what they're discussing itself, right? What happens when we try and control things like our environment or the boundaries of the fight is that we become partners in controlling that together.
Yeah.
And that's why that fight goes well and why people still feel happy afterwards. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
I mean, so when you have, spats or misgivings or like
Sure.
little, the tensions that happen in any relationship.
Yes.
Is there like a consistent pattern there? Like what do you think happens?
I feel like the professional communicator part of me is aware that we are operating at different, one is an emotional conversation and one is a practical one. So
Yeah.
to me, that is, and this is one of the reasons I resonate so deeply with your work, because that's foundational to it, right? That's like the core framework. And I genuinely, and I would say generally, recognize that this is happening. sometimes if I'm really honest, I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to have that conversation right now. So I'm going to try
Right.
and bring the conversation to, I'm going to make this an emotional conversation, get you out of
Yeah.
practical. And my wife's like, I'm not looking for you to solve my problems. I want you to hear me and
Right.
just say, honey, I'm so sorry or whatever. And I find that if there's a real disconnection, that both of us have sort of anchored in, this is the kind of conversation I want to have right now. I'm short on time and too practical, and Kate just wants to be seen and heard. And so, those are places where I feel the most aware that misgivings either happen or continue or stay stuck. I guess if I let it all melt away, I would just say if I can park my own ego, just to be totally blunt, I always feel better when I'm able to make the offer the bow across
Yeah.
across the aisle or whatever. So
Yeah. No, I think that's so I hear you saying two things. One is not everything has to be a conversation at that given moment, right? Like
correct.
sometimes like you're in one mindset and your wife is in another mindset and you don't have enough time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really good and healthy to say like, this is a conversation I want to have. I can't have it right now.
Yeah.
Nobody should ever have to have a conversation they don't want to have because it's probably not going to go well.
Yeah.
But the second thing that happens in those situations is that, and this is actually the third skill that super communicators have, is it usually sounds like it gets better when you prove you're listening to each other, even if you don't have time to really get into it, right? To get deep.
Game changer.
Yeah.
For us, game changer. Like the ability, and I call it sort of the meta, it's like a meta skill, like the awareness about the conversation that you're having rather than about the topic. And
that's exactly right.
And my wife was
right.
also so smart and thoughtful. And it, you tend to, there's so many times like the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And so our ability, and this originally came out through, I would say, verbal communication, to be aware that we're having a conversation that is not successful, or is not set up for success. The ability to sort of zoom out and navigate that together, because it does feel like we're like, okay, we're doing that thing. Like, it actually was infectious to other areas of our life.
Huh.
And
that's interesting.
Yeah. And around, just, planning for the future or dreams that we had, or if we start to feel that our dreams were not on the same page, or that the conversation was creating sort of a wedge rather than a connection, it's like, cool, what if we reframed this?
Yeah.
And remind one another that it's okay to not want the same things. In fact, that's probably why we're together, is the complementary, there's just the sort of a meta, and to be totally transparent, Charles, she is a meditation and a mindfulness teacher.
So she's great at this. Like, I'm sure
ninja.
she wallops you. Like anytime you're like, she's like, yeah, no, that's a good partner to have.
Yeah. Awareness is her superpower. And so I'm grateful for her. And that's one of the reasons I think I can be a little bit of a bull in a china shop. So,
yeah,
but I find this is one of the reasons your work is so simultaneously relatable and crazy powerful. Like if you are the skills, there's not a ton of skills. There's lots of subtlety. That's the point that I was trying to make earlier.
Yeah.
But once you're sort of trained in some of these basics, and you have, we're going to develop an awareness, boy, I really feel like the tractor beam, the progress it feels like you all of a sudden have leverage in the thoughtful, earnest,
totally, and you know what to focus on, right?
Totally, yeah, you know what to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think so. So it's interesting, like this proving that we're listening, which is I think what you and your wife are doing. It sounds like she's like a master at this.
Yes.
Oftentimes, when we are listening, the other person doesn't know that we're listening, right? Like we assume that that I'm paying attention, but like it's just hardwired into our brain that there's always, particularly in hard conversations, there's always this like thing in the back of our brain that says they're not listening, they're waiting their turn to speak. And so there's actually like this technique known as looping for understanding that I love. That's like the simplest, dumbest thing on earth. But study after study has shown that it can like transform negotiations and hard conversations. It has 3 steps. You ask a question, a deep question. You repeat back in your own words what you just heard the person say, right?
And you did that a second ago, by the way. Let me tell you what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like let them, and I didn't do this. The third step is the critical one, which we always forget, which is ask if I got it right. Like, am I hearing you correctly? Because what happens when we do that third step is we are asking the other person for permission to acknowledge that we were listening.
Mm.
And again, this is hardwired into our brains. When we believe someone is listening to us, we almost can't help but listen to them in return. Like this reciprocity is one of the most fundamental parts of our neurology. And so as a result, proving that we're listening is just a simple skill, just asking yourself, like, I just had a conversation. Did I prove to the other person that I heard what they said? Half the time, you're going to be like, no, I didn't. But once you start just paying attention to it, you're going to do it all the time. You're going to do it without even noticing you're doing it.
Yeah.
And it can transform conversations.
We were speaking before recording that I have a new book out, and the first chapter in this new book is about attention and how valuable it is. It's the master skill to know how to direct it. And I sort of posed the question in there, which I did get this from my wife, the ninja. It's like, have you ever have had someone pay very clear attention to you? Like you are 100% aware that the person is listening. It's so connecting, and it is so, it is like a superpower, but I feel like it reminds you how often most people don't listen. To be paid attention to is like this amazing gesture.
It feels wonderful.
Yeah. And there's a section in the book, I think it's the hedge fund.
Yeah.
The hedge fund, it's about listening, and the hedge fund
right,
folks. Maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah. This guy, Nicholas Epley, who's spent his whole life studying deep questions, he does this experiment. I've started doing it from stages too, where he goes into this conference of hedge funders. They asked him to come like talk about his research. And he says, what I want you to do is I want you to turn to the person next to you and ask and answer one question. And that question is, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? And then he says, how many of you think this is going to be fun? And nobody raises their hand, right? Like nobody wants to do this. And he explains why it's an important, like why it's a good experiment. And he's done it before. And he's a professor at the University of Chicago. And then they do it. And I've done this myself from stages a number of times. People start having this conversation and you cannot get them to shut up. Like literally, like you, like it's 2 minutes per person, like, like back and forth between two people. They will just talk and talk and talk and talk. And eventually when you shut them up, get them to stop talking, and you ask them like, for how many of you is that a better experience than you anticipated it would be? Every single hand goes up. Some people say things like, that was the best conversation I've had in the last month. And it's because a question like that invites us a little bit, actually mandates us, right? So that's an example of a question that you
don't kind of work though, because you're also there. It's a given.
You're in a conference. You've been given permission by the speaker.
If I'm a guest on your show and you tell me, when was the last time you cried? I'm like, bro, we're just getting started.
Exactly.
Here. Come on.
Exactly. Let's ease into it a little bit.
Sure. But in this context, it's very effective at making the point.
And I think what happens is that not only do people say something real and meaningful, but the other person cannot help themselves but do that tractor beam that you just talked about, right? Mm-hmm. If I talk about like my dad who died 7 years ago and like crying at his funeral, there's no way you don't lean forward and look at me and like kind of like make like, show me that you're paying attention. Like your whole body, your whole demeanor shows me that you are focused on what, and then it's so natural for me to ask the question back and to give you that same level of attention. So I think one of the things that Epley's research has found is that we tend to assume those kinds of conversations are going to be way harder than they actually are. And we also assume they're going to be less rewarding than they actually are.
Bingo.
But when we do it, when we have those conversations, when we ask a deep question, when we like give ourselves over to listening to the other person instead of thinking about what we're going to say next, something amazing happens. And we end up liking and trusting and feeling close to each other.
All of us have been in a conversation with a person who is a brilliant communicator, and it is incredibly seductive, and not in a smarmy way. It is just so connecting. And again, that is why your work is A, so valuable and important, and B, so timely. Remember, 3 conversations like, what is this really about? How do we feel? Who are we? thank you so much for putting these sorts of questions at the center of communication in a world at a time where we seem to feel we probably are in many cases more disconnected than ever before. And I feel like you've given us some tools, something to cling on to. And for the people who think about this through the lens of being an entrepreneur or being a solopreneur, an artist, the ability to communicate your vision to the world it's probably one of the big differences between success and failure. Jeff Bezos's letters to investors are famous for the ability to articulate, we're building, this generation's game-changing company. It's going to be long and hard. Basically sets the framework. It's an amazing, I call it a set of artifacts about how to communicate masterfully through the written word. That's, not at all the best example. You are so brilliant at trotting out examples, given your journalism background. Again, highly recommend the book, Supercommunicators. Charles, it has been a treat to have you for the past hour on the show here. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners before you scoot? Anywhere you'd like to direct our attention? We're very good at buying book. The book's already been out. It is we try and time these things with, you were too busy for us to have you on the show when you first launched this thing, but anywhere else you'd like to direct our attention while you have it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to reach out to me, my website is charlesduhigg.com. My email address is charles@charlesduhigg.com.
Two G's.
Two G's. Yeah. I actually read and respond to every single email that I get from a reader. But the other thing I would say is, we're in an election season, right? Mm-hmm. It's a time when it's really natural to have tough conversations. Also, Thanksgiving's coming up, right? Everyone like worries about what
this is from a guy who knows communication.
Exactly.
Communication day every year is coming up.
Yeah, I think if everyone says sometime in the next month, I want to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with me, and my goal is just to understand how they see the world. It's not to convince them that I'm right and they're wrong. It's not to challenge them. I literally just want to understand, what is it about the Trump that's so compelling to you? Or what is it about Kamala that's so compelling to you? Or what is it about guns or, trans rights? If we practice that, we become better people. And it's just a matter, that does not mean that conversation has to go really well. It does not mean you have to walk away agreeing with each other. It does not mean it won't be awkward. But if you just say, look, I'm going to do this for 10 minutes, it becomes a habit. And that is what a democracy is built on, is us having those conversations and saying, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I understand how you see the world. Thank you for sharing with me. And then living side by side. And let's hope the country remembers that over the next couple of months.
Well, the potent combination of having written one of the best books on habits ever in the history of habit books and having done the same in a book about communication, building the habit of communication is probably somewhere along the lines of the path to salvation for us culturally.
Yeah.
And certainly is, ought to be seen as a superpower for the people who are listening and watching right now, for in your business, your life. If you're looking to transform any aspect of your life, being able to communicate both with yourself and others about that vision is critical. So thank you for encouraging us to build this habit. Grateful that you've been a guest on the show, and people know where to go to get the book and now to pay extra attention to you. Thank you so much for your time, Charles.
Thank you for having me. This has been so amazing.
Likewise, and for everybody out there in the world, from Charles and myself, we hope you have an amazing day. Until next time.